Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and in today's video we finally get to see the Season 2 Mythic Plus Affix for Shadowlands patch 9.1. It's available for testing over on the PTR. In today's video, we hopped in with the boys, guildies mostly, on the PTR servers to test this out to see what the early version of the seasonal affix looks like. This seasonal affix is really interesting because it offers some of the Torghast powers, most of them being very unique to the Mythic Plus environment, like using certain affixes as powers, kind of reorganized to benefit players rather than hurt them, and other different powers for tanks, healers, as well as DPS. And in today's video, I want to show you what it looks like so far, what the elite enemies that drop these Torghast powers look like, what are some of the different mechanics that they offer, how this whole affix seems to be structured, and show off some of the strongest powers that are absolutely broken and most likely we'll see a lot of tuning before the release of 9.1. The first dungeon is going to be Theater of Pain, and the first elite enemy we'll see is actually going to be Executioner Veruth. He is one of the 4 elite enemies scattered through the dungeon, usually found pretty early on. These elite enemies all have specific abilities and specific debuffs that they offer, so while fighting them you're affected by a debuff, which might make him super deadly when you pull these elites together with other mobs if, let's say, you're trying to group everything up and nuke it down in Mythic Pluses to save time. Once defeated, they drop you anima powers, and it can be a little bit of variety and some RNG between what powers you get, but it also does give players a little bit of customizability so they can pick the powers that helps them for different dungeons and different environments. Executioner Veruth decreases the amount of healing that your party gets by 50%. That's his passive. He does a lot of tank damage, putting a massive bleed, and then he also charges to a random ally of yours, putting a massive bleed on him as well. This guy just does a lot of physical damage and is very unfriendly to healers. Upon killing him, we picked up one of the 3 powers. For me, I have Champion's Brand, which gives you haste or crit if you're above 70% health. Volcanic Plume, which is basically a volcanic effect, but for me, my abilities have a chance to pop a volcanic under an enemy, doing a bunch of fire damage, knocking them up in the air. As well as Dagger of Necrotic Wounding, which gives me Necrotic Affix as a debuff that I can put on the enemy, reducing their healing, absorbs, as well as doing physical damage to them, stacking. I decided to go with a Volcanic Plume, and that turned out to be a very powerful Torghast power. In the chat you can see who picked up which powers. We have a Champion's Brand for Glomp, so he has the haste or crit if he's above a certain amount of health. We picked up a couple other Volcanic Plumages for the DPS, and Stygian King's Barbs, which is like a tank thorns. When enemies attack them, a portion of the damage based on tank's health is reflected back on the enemy, just like Druid's Thorns would work. So we picked up some really strong ones for damage, and the tank can hold aggro much easier even though they're just a blood DK. The second elite enemy is Sogadon the Breaker. We actually ended up pulling him with one of the elite mobs found at the entrance of the PvP quarter of Theater of Pain. Probably not a good idea because Sogadon is a tank buster. He will empower himself when he does a ton of damage, but he is much slower, so a tank will have to cut him in circles. He also does this AoE stomp, just make sure you're not standing next to him, and the whole time that you're fighting him, you take 50% more physical damage. So together, combined with some of the more powerful enemies inside of Theater of Pain that do a lot of physical damage, probably not a good idea to pull him together with other mobs. Although, it doesn't seem like the elite enemies, at least from our testing, are super social with the mobs near them. They will pull because they have a pretty big proximity, but if, let's say, you pull them by themselves, if they're near a trash bag of mobs, they usually will go solo without any of the other dungeon mobs following them. So that might allow players a little bit easier time compared to what we were having with. After defeating Sogadon, we actually got very defense-oriented powers. For me, I had the choice of the Stone Ward, which is an absorb shield every 30 seconds for 30% of my health, or Leech when I'm below 25% health with Dripping Fang, or Roots of Shaldrasil. If you're standing still, you get a heal for 6% of your health every 3 seconds. It's interesting that they gave you 3 different defensive options, and I guess all of them can be good depending on the class that you're playing. If you're not expecting to move a lot like a caster would, you'll actually gain quite a lot of value from the self-heal. Or if you're a melee, always in the fray, afraid of getting hurt by mechanics, the absorb might come more in handy. In the Plague Quarter, we picked up yet another elite, Oros Coldheart. He has a couple different mechanics. First of all, his aura gives you a permanent 50% movement speed reduction. His 2 active abilities are Frost Lance, which is just a frontal. Make sure you're not standing in front of the boss when he's firing off the Frost Lance, otherwise it's basically 100% dead. The other one is a little bit more tough to manage. It is Biting Cold. He marks a player and puts an AoE frost ring around them, which does insane amounts of damage. This AoE frost ring does so much damage, it almost feels like it's supposed to be a mechanic that you're supposed to split the damage for, having your allies jump in the ring to help split it, but that's not the case. I think it might just be one of those mechanics that a healer will really just have to focus on, the person with the Biting Cold, or you have to rotate defensives, but also class immunities will be very handy if you do have to deal with this guy. Upon defeating this elite, we got more utilitarian powers. You can either take less damage from AoE attacks, or when you drop below a certain amount of health, you gain a massive defensive, or upon interrupting enemies, those enemies take more damage. So as a melee with a very short interrupt, it makes sense for me to go with the interrupt playstyle. One of our members got a Satchel of the Hunt, which gives us all movement speed increase. So it seems like from this elite, you have a chance to get powers that are not really offensive, defensive, but more utilitarian in nature. And finally, in the caster quarter of Theater of Pain, we have Incinerator Arcaleth. While engaged with him, your party continuously takes fire damage. He'll also close off parts of the room that you're fighting him on with Scorching Blast. He seems to target players for this ability, so making sure that you're baiting Scorching Blast in the right spot is going to be extremely important. Melt Soul is another ability he'll cast quite often, where he'll put a debuff on one of your party members that is dispellable. However, he puts out so many of these that a healer will have a harder time trying to dispel everybody. This is where a priest or any class that has any kind of magic immunities or dispels, it will come in handy. Upon defeating him, we got some offensive powers, and for me, I ended up picking up one that's more of like an execute mechanic. The more you hit enemies while you're there at low health, the more damage you do to them. I also could have chosen the bolstering power, where as enemies die around you within 40 yards, it actually gives you a stacking buff, so you do more damage. So I imagine in a pool where you have a bunch of enemies pulled, and you continuously pull them over and over, running around with a 20% buff would actually be quite powerful, as long as you're a class with a lot of big AoE, and as long as enemies are dying every 20 seconds. The way that all of these elites work is if any of them are not defeated by the time you engage the final boss, their passive debuffs will also work for the final boss. That is the physical damage debuff, where you take more physical damage, the healing reduction, the movement speed reduction, or even the dot. It's possible that in the future we'll have playstyles and routes planned around skipping some of these mobs. However, they do offer you powers. These powers can really swing the direction of the game in terms of the extra damage they provide, the defensive bonuses, the utilitarian stuff. And it also is very difficult to skip these guys unless they're in a good spot away from the main routes, because they do have things like Spectral Eye, so they will see stealthy, so shrouding past them will be pretty difficult. You might be able to maybe Night Elf stealth them, but we haven't really been able to test the range of their Spectral Sight. We're also not sure if the mobs, the elites that spawn for the seasonal affix, if they're spawned in specific locations, or does that location change week by week? If anything, I'm guessing that it's very similar to the Battle for Azeroth Season 4 Affix, where you have set locations where they spawn, but which mob spawns in which location is going to be on a rotation. I think it might end up being one of those affixes where you will want to actually fight these guys, because the powers that they offer you, I feel like, are way too good. Blizzard is definitely going to have to do some tuning because some of them are really overpowered, but it's actually a really cool experience and a very fresh affix. What I like about this one versus Prideful is you can actually have a bit more freedom in how you plan your routes. Prior to this, with Prideful, you have to plan your routes 20% at a time, because every 20% of the enemies that you kill, you spawn Pride, and then you want to use the Pride buff in order to deal with the next trash pack very quickly, or deal with the boss as quickly as possible. With this affix, however, it's a little bit different, where you can actually have more freedom in which enemies you pull and how you plan your route, and you can kind of customize exactly when you want to pull these mobs. I think the idea with this affix is maybe the strategy is most likely going to be to rush to get these elites to pick up these powers so the rest of the dungeon goes by faster. So planning out your routes and trying to maximize your powers as early as possible might be the go-to. A very interesting affix, and I can't wait to try it out some more in PTR, and I can't wait for it to come out. So far, this thing looks really exciting. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts, and as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.